This weekend in India, perhaps the most lucrative women's sports league in the world is coming to the end of its third edition. The WPL started in 2023. 5 teams were sold, generating revenue of more than $500 million. A 5-year television broadcast deal was signed with Viacom for $111 million, working out at about $1 million per match. Some of the top players in the league can earn $400,000 for 3 to 4 weeks of playing activity. One of my favourite guests is Amit Gupta, who talks about all things sport, but relative to what's going on in the rest of the world. And as you'll see, in part of this interview, where we started discussing when are we ever going to see parity between men's and women's sport, I think it's still a fair way off, it led to all sorts of discussions about the rise of Trump, about the rise of India, about the impact of Saudi Arabia, and a whole lot more. Take a listen. Where do you sit on this argument?
It's really complicated. Unfortunately, you and I are not the people who are doing the pay dispensations here, because we could sit and say, yep, as a matter of principle, it's equal pay. And let's take some of the money from the men's game and move it to the women's game. It's businesses, and businesses look at the bottom line. And they're looking at the fact that 3,000 people show up for an women's Ashes game, 103,000 show up for the India-Australia game. And that essentially drives profit margins, that drives marketing, that drives everything. Having said that, I think there are interesting areas where a statement could have been made. I'll give you the example of women's football in America. Meaning women's soccer. Women's soccer doesn't really have that big a fan following in the United States at the local level. I think Portland is the one team which has this huge fan base. The rest of them don't. But at the national level, and they sell out every game they play. They win. I mean, they've won so many World Cups and Olympics that I've lost count now. But the point is that I argued why, instead of getting into this thing of wage equality, the women should say pay us double for the international games, because face facts, we're more successful. Everybody knows our names. I do not know the name of an American men's soccer player. And I personally don't care either. The women, you know all their names. And the other thing they've done in women's soccer is they actually have personalities. They used to have Hope Solo, who was quite controversial, but was fun. Megan Rapinoe took a very dedicated stand against racism and on LGBT issues and so on. You need more people like that in the game. People who sort of transcend the game, where people who know nothing about soccer tune in to watch Megan Rapinoe.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing in cricket. You don't really have somebody like that in the women's game yet. And the last point is, I mean, and this you're going to have to talk to the marketing people or people in women's studies about, why is it that Ferrari or Lamborghini or Rolex never really get women to advertise their products? Women, it's more let's do Chanel number 5 or whatever. So until you can make that transition, I just don't see where the money is going to come from, because those are the big earners for the men. I mean, I'd have to go back and look at Federer's sponsorships, but I would say out of the 100 sponsorships he had, 85 of them may have been super luxury goods.
Yeah.
And there's,
you
sorry.
made me think of something. I don't know a single woman who drives a Ferrari.
Well, because women look at it and they make the argument, it's a silly, pointless car. And where in Sydney are you going to drive a Ferrari?
I'd like one.
We'd all love one. I mean, I'd love a Ferrari, but I know Sydney traffic.
Yes,
good luck,
that's right.
Good luck driving beyond first gear in your Ferrari in Sydney traffic. So what's the point?
Yeah, you're right.
So women are looking at that and saying, what am I going to do with this thing? So I just don't see that happening. But there is I think there's a need for having women who transcend gender and can market anything. And when that comes, I think you'll see a real change in women's sports.
And what's that going to take? Like if we look at the men, Federer never really transcended being a tennis player. He never really stood for anything. He never took a stance on anything, did he? He was the ultimate gentleman.
Yeah.
And so how come the men can do that, but the women can't? Why do the women have to be the ones that really stand out for those reasons, whether it's Serena Williams or Megan Rapinoe, Hope Solo, as you mentioned, and there are others?
Oh, there's a lot. Look, I would say this: the men are tied down by their contracts, and they're not courageous. In my lifetime, I can think of maybe four athletes, five actually, who took a principled stand: Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and Peter Norman. And then Colin Kaepernick. But it's been a long time since Colin Kaepernick took the knee to protest certain issues.
And it's interesting because all of those you mentioned, they really suffered.
They all suffered.
They all suffered.
Yeah.
Smith and Carlos could barely get a job.
Right.
Peter Norman never represented Australia again. And for those that are not aware, they were all part of the medal dais at the 1968 Olympics with the Black Power salute, talking about race relations in the US. Muhammad Ali, I'm sure everybody knows, the great boxer who took a stance against going to fight in Vietnam, and he was threatened with jail and had his titles eradicated. Who was the other one you mentioned? Colin Kaepernick. Never played again.
And I'll just add one thing about Peter Norman. Norman was such a classy guy. He didn't do something idiotic like give a Black Power salute on the stand, because that would have looked like him doing Wakanda Forever, which I think should not be done by certain people. He just wore the Olympics human rights badge. Just to make the point very subtly that I stand with you. And he was a man of deep convictions. But as you say, he paid the price for it. In the women's side, I mean, and this is, I'd like to hear what you think of this. I think there's a bit of, excuse me, sexism in the sense that it's the women protesting on these issues, who cares? Which is why the reaction, while it was nasty, was not as harsh as it was with Kaepernick. That nobody decided, all right, we're throwing Megan Rapinoe out of the team, or we're going to tell the other women that they can't take the knee, or so on. I really do believe that that's there. And I mean, I wrote an article on the 5th of November for an Indian newspaper on the morning of the American elections, which was 4 p.m. here, or on the 4th evening here. And I said, one of the reasons Donald Trump is going to win is misogyny. And believe me, that's going to be there. And sure enough, that's exactly, now everybody's acting like, oh, yeah, well, there was misogyny. You didn't know this before?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, this is just ridiculous.
Here's the thing on the other side of that, and it's really interesting to see what is going to happen with the world and the world of sport under this Trump presidency, because I remember last time when Trump was elected and there were expectations that the world was going to end. The world didn't end. And what we saw from Trump is, for whatever reason and for whatever underlying reason, is that he's not a warmonger. And the US machine has been built on warmongering, to be frank. So again, it's no surprise he's doing what he's doing, with regard to Russia and Ukraine. Anyone could have seen that. But I'm disappointed in the media coverage because it's just 100% negative, and I can't help thinking that if it was the Democrats that got elected and there were Republicans storming through the streets, setting fires to cars or car manufacturing companies or petrol houses, the media would be going feral. Right now, they're kind of championing this kind of right to protest. It's interesting. We pick and choose our protests. With regard to the 5 men that you nominated, Peter Norman was the only white male.
Right.
All of the rest, and I've looked at this myself, the history of protests through sport and the people that have really stood out, and they have all been predominantly black men. When it comes to women, it's a different story, and they're standing for very different issues. But if we can wind this back to the WPL where we started the conversation, India and Saudi Arabia are now playing significant roles in where sport is going.
Yes.
And in that regard, they're not going to want protests because they have their own issues in their own countries that they are dealing with. Is it wrong that we should be doing business with countries that we might not ideologically agree with? Or do you see that there is a chance there to, by having a relationship, we can make significant changes and we can understand each other a little bit better? Is sport that, that thing that we always say it is? It's got the ability to make the world better.
It's, well, I have an article coming out on sports washing, which essentially covers this. And my feeling is the West can't talk about countries like Saudi Arabia anymore, because over the last 5 years or so, it has moved away from everything it endorsed as being a rules-based international order. Look, on Ukraine, 35 countries, which was 4.4 billion of the global population, abstained on the UN vote to condemn Russia. Their argument was, this is yet another European mess. Why should we get into it? And then Gaza comes along, and the American resolution, which says condemn Hamas, ask for a ceasefire, fails. The Jordanian resolution, and what is Jordan, 4 or 5 million people, which says we condemn nobody, but we call for an immediate ceasefire, passes with 121 to 10 in the UN General Assembly. And that should say that if you're going to say there are certain rules in the international system, human rights matter, so on, then you need to start abiding with them, even though it may not be convenient for you at that point of time. And I'll just give you an example. I mean, since we are talking Trump is the one pushing for the LIV PGA merger to take place. See,
LIV being the Saudi-backed Rebel Golf Tour. Greg was associated with it, no longer, but yeah, and it's been hugely successful when they play their leg in Adelaide. The crowds turn up en masse. Yeah. People absolutely love it, and yet the media here almost refuses to cover it because of an ideological stance against Saudi Arabia. And yet our government's doing business with Saudi Arabia. We trade with Saudi Arabia. Sport is constantly carrying this can.
Sport carries the can because it's the easy one to target. Go ask the New Zealanders, will you stop meat supplies to Saudi Arabia over there? Because in the month of Ramadan, that's when New Zealand makes a lot of money exporting sheep to Saudi Arabia. So I don't take much of this criticism seriously. I think what's happened is these countries have the money, they have the vision. Both Qatar and Saudi Arabia have a 2030 program. If you look at the WPL, or actually look at the BCCI, to sort of bring it back, the BCCI has brought about the horizontal integration of cricket, which is they now own the South African Premier League because they've invested in all the teams there. They own the West Indian Premier League. They've invested in everything there. They own the Dubai Premier, or parts of the Dubai, I stand corrected. And they own parts of the US Premier League. And now they're buying teams in England, like Hampshire and so on. And the reason being, they say we can manage this. But I mean, Tracy, there's another part to this, which I gave a talk at the University of Chichester, and people got very upset with me because it's England. And England still thinks that there's a global empire out there, which is one of the reasons they hated.
And they run it.
And they run it. And this was one of the reasons they hated Kerry Packer. Ooh, that colonial. I mean, what? In the 1970s, you're using a term colonial, but it's the Imperial Cricket Council became the International Cricket Council in 1966. Let's not forget that. But the interesting thing was, Jagmohan Dalmia became the chairman of the ICC, or the president of the ICC. And he inherited a organization which had $17,000 in the bank, which there are restaurants in Sydney which have more in their bank accounts because they have to meet payroll and pay for the supplies and so on. When he left it, After 3 years, he left it with 40 million in the bank. And they were upset. They were like, well, what's wrong with amateurism? I said, this is what's wrong with amateurism. Every self-respecting cricketers of great potential had to retire in their late 20s because they were losing money playing cricket. And these are the people, I mean, they should be putting up statues of these people because of what they did for cricket. I'm not just talking Dalmia, but it's the same thing for women now. If you're making 300,000 or even 100,000 a year playing in the WPL, you can now do other things with your life. And you don't have to go day to day scraping by because you've now got a nice nest egg and you can plan the rest of your life and so on. And I think this is the good part in it. Now, this doesn't in any way, from my point of view, absolve the treatment of women in Saudi Arabia, the issue of gay rights, the problems of with misogyny in any part of the world, for that matter. But we need to recognize that they see sports as an avenue for global branding. They're investing heavily in it. And they're slowly going to draw people away, much in the same way. If you look at it, what's happening in business, a lot of the really bright CEOs move to corporations in Dubai or other places. You're seeing it in academia. You go to China now, China's full of Europeans and Americans and so on, because they're getting the money to do the research they want to do. So this shift is coming.
A big shift, as you say. And I think the other thing that's important to point out, it comes back to what you said a little bit earlier about them having a vision. And it's not just about global branding, but it is about trying to facilitate systemic change inside their own populations, which are fraught with danger, whether you're talking about China or India with massive populations and they're not all aligned, or you're talking about small populations but very, very religiously conservative in places like Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia. You have to be very careful with change.
Sure.
Otherwise there's be a terrible backlash. And that change is actually happening and sport is facilitating that. And I think it's important we always remember that instead of coming down so heavily and saying that it's only about sports washing, because the British Empire certainly, played its part in sports washing around the world for 100 years or so more.
It certainly did.
You can hear the entire interview with Ahmed Gupta on the Sports Ambassador podcast, which you can find on Patreon or Spotify, or just stay tuned here and I'll continue to bring you excerpts from the podcast.